Disciples, then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamp and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look! Here is the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him in the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. So last week, I was browsing the internet, and I saw a post on Reddit that asked, "Hey, people born before 1990, what trivial skills do you have that you can't use anymore?" So as you can imagine, there were a lot of posts about people talking about having to remember other people's cell phone numbers, with many people saying, "The only reason I know my spouse's number is because I need it for grocery rewards." Others commented on being able to fold a map like a pro, or how to use a pencil to fix a cassette tape that became a little bit too unwound. One person said, "I can cover a textbook with a brown paper bag." And as I was starting to percolate over this week's sermon text, I came across an answer that really stood out to me. It said, "My trivial skill was being on time because I couldn't call someone to reschedule." And in today's gospel reading, we hear a parable with a very similar theme about making sure you understand what time it is. In the parable of the 10 bridesmaids that we just read, we have this group of 10 women who are waiting to meet the bridegroom. And kind of right off the bat, we know, this is a little weird, because in a typical wedding, the bridesmaids are waiting for the bride because they're the ones who have to attend to her. In fact, it's weird that there's no mention of the bride at all, and apparently there's some sources where the bride is there, but not enough that our translators felt good enough about putting it in. But moving on, there's a main point here, that there's 5 bridesmaids who are called wise, and 5 bridesmaids who are called foolish. And the 5 are labeled wise because they brought flasks of oil with their lamp, and the 5 are labeled foolish because they didn't bring any oil with them. Nobody had any idea when the bridegroom was coming because he was running late and presumably didn't have a cell phone to let them know when he was coming. But eventually he shows up, and when the foolish women asked to borrow some oil, the wise women said, "Get out of here. There's not enough. Go get your own." So the women leave, and they start looking for a store that sells lamp oil at midnight, which was presumably really hard because they didn't have a 24-hour Walmart next door. So on their chase for oil, they go, they come back, and they find the door to the wedding banquet shut. And when they ask to come in, the bridegroom says, "Truly, I don't know you." And then finally, in the last line, it says, "Keep awake, because we don't know the hour and the day." And keep in mind, Jesus started off this parable and said, "This is what heaven is like." What? This is what heaven is like? So I think that needs some digging into. And the first key area of this parable is about being prepared. So in this story, the women who thought ahead to bring the lamp oil were the ones who were categorized as wise, right? So we have to think this to ourselves: how does Jesus want us to prepare for his coming, given that we have no idea when it's going to happen. It could be in millennia, or it could be in a few seconds. Okay, we're good. Put in another way, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do with our wait? So sometimes it helps to figure out what we don't do. With the last line of the parable being, "Keep awake, therefore, for you don't know the day nor the hour," we know this admonition is not about keeping in a constant state of alertness, because all the bridesmaids became drowsy and fell asleep, and the wise were still called wise. We're not meant to be constantly focusing on the end times as some groups of Christians are. We're not called to be doomsday preppers, to build our bunkers and fill them with Twinkies and canned things that could barely be called food. No, for Christians, our wait isn't about physical preparation in that way. Instead, I think our wait is about leaning into being a disciple of Jesus and letting that process change us. And thankfully, Jesus made it really plain on how we're supposed to do this. In Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40, he says, someone asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was. And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." That's it. Two things. You can't really get much simpler than that. But as we also know, just because something is simple doesn't mean it's always easy. In fact, the world has stacked the deck against us by making us so distracted that we lose the time that we need to actually love each other well. I think for many of us, the pressures of careers and family and school and sometimes church, these other things that we have to fill our lives, the amount of free time that we have is diminishing greatly, and that free time that we do have is becoming increasingly easy to waste thanks to our smartphones and all the other distractions that try to get all of our attention. Study after study has shown what we collectively know in our hearts, that the pace and the amount of things that we're trying to shove in our days is simply unsustainable. The world right now is just too much and too fast, and we need to slow down, because at the rate we're going, it's not possible to love others the way that Jesus called us to. We're letting the world dictate who we are instead of letting Jesus shape us into who we are supposed to be. And because collectively we're so harrowed and exhausted, we always think there's going to be more time to do these things. But the parable says, no, there's a finality coming at some point, and at some point it's going to be too late. And for the foolish women, they were just excluded from the wedding party. But for us, the stakes are slightly higher because we're talking about heaven. And unfortunately, one of the best teachers of this lesson is death. For instance, when our loved ones pass away too soon, we're sad because we thought we would have had more time together. Consciously and unconsciously, we had made plans and we pictured our lives in certain ways, and then suddenly our loved ones aren't here anymore. And our lives are never the same again. And on the other side of the life cycle, here's an example. My wife and I were just in an adoption process, and we waited for a long time. Because the agency that we were working with had over 70% of their placements being an emergency placement, which means, hey, there's a baby here and nobody made any plans. We really need to help this child have some care. We were essentially pregnant, but we had no idea how far along we were. It could be a few minutes, or it could be years. And one day, as my wife went to go take a nap and I started to play video games, we got that call that said, hey, Your son's in Pennsylvania. Come pick him up. And our lives completely changed in the blink of an eye. Like Jesus, we knew our son was going to come eventually, so we simply did our best to prepare our hearts and minds for what was coming. It's often said that we love others because God first loved us, and while that's 100% true, it's not the entirety of the situation. You see, neuroscience is just starting to catch up with what Jesus was talking about, and we've come to find out that God has literally wired our brains to reward us when we love others the way that Jesus calls us to. Science often calls this the helper's high. And essentially, it's a mixture of dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins that not only improve your mood, but also encourages you to keep doing that behavior, which creates this positive, self-enforcing loop that encourages us to keep helping and loving our neighbors. God has literally wired so that for every act of loving our neighbor, we also receive a reminder of God's love through us, through our biological systems, which God designed. And I may be nerding out here, but that's really cool. God has literally built a self-reinforcing feedback loop about loving and caring for others into our brains. And in spiritual terms, that loop is really at the core of Christian discipleship, because we become more like Jesus when we love others in the amazing ways that Jesus did. Amen? Because of Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross for us, we don't need to climb our way to heaven ourselves. God isn't up there punching tickets and with every 10 good deeds we get a free frozen yogurt. What a blessing that we don't have to worry about doing enough to earn our way to heaven. Instead, we embrace Jesus' free gift of salvation simply by being ourselves. And in return, Jesus wants nothing but our love and for us to be the best versions of ourselves by loving others so that others can see Jesus' love through our words and our actions. To roughly quote Martin Luther, God doesn't need our good deeds, but our neighbors sure do. And as neuroscience is telling us, we do too. So what do we do with our weight? We push back on the world and its craziness of trying to tell us what we need to fill our time with, and instead we carve out time to start loving other people. All we have to do is actually go out and meet someone face to face. Serve in food kitchens, kitchen pantries, homeless shelters, care for the sick, the immigrants, the orphans, the widows, and all those who need care. Visit people in prisons. Whatever you do, make it personal. Donating items and money are great and necessary, but ultimately those things aren't going to change you. If you're not getting this biological, this is great feeling when you're helping, God may be calling you to help in a different, more direct way, even though it might be really uncomfortable or really scary. So if you look at the four Gospels, Jesus was always very hands-on with the people that he was helping. And Jesus wants us to be just as hands-on, producing the type of love that's cultivated as you're face-to-face walking with your neighbor through, honestly, a really messy life sometimes. But that's the type of love that changes us and changes others. For the bridesmaids, preparation was about being prepared with oil. But for us as Christians, preparation is leaning in to loving others like Jesus did. However we do that, Jesus calls us to get started on it right now, because the world is actively trying to stop us from experiencing and creating that type of love, and soon it may be too late. So as you go through the week, pay attention for hints on how God may be calling you to love people you come in contact with, because you never know what God will tell you. Amen?